Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Traumatology. I'm joined here by Dr. Miller today, and we will be talking about trauma inside of the brain today.
Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning, Dr. Miller. So when we talk about trauma in the brain, a lot of the times we hear about a stress response. Can you kind of explain what the stress response looks like and what the function of it is, not necessarily to do with trauma, but just as a general survival mechanism?
Well, I think in general, think of the brain as sort of the head of the operation. And when a person goes through some sort of experience in which they are perceiving that they're not safe, the brain will start to take a look at what it needs to do. How does it prepare the body to respond in a way, fight, flight, or freeze, that it can activate into doing what it needs to find safety, to create some control in an environment that the brain is actually picking up as it is not safe for the person. So the brain has all sorts of neural networks and mechanisms to get the body to respond. And one of the chemicals that is talked about a lot is the chemical cortisol. And through the sympathetic system, cortisol is released. And cortisol basically says, get your heart rate up, shut down your digestion because you don't need to eat right now because we have other things to deal with. And let's get the blood flow into your hands, feet, get your body, kind of the primitive responses to, do we need to run? Do we need to fight? Or maybe we need to hide. And so the brain itself will perceive through a lot of the sensory mechanisms, what is happening in this environment. Do I feel like I'm going to be okay in this environment? So it fires into the emotion center, the amygdala, and then it gets the primitive responses kind of up and running using a lot like a chemical, but there's a lot of neural networks that are going to function around that and basically prepares us to figure out what to do in that environment and to respond to the environment for whatever period of time we need to, go through that experience. And it even has a shutdown valve that if it's too much for our system, that we can be in that experience but not be fully experiencing it in the external world. We call that dissociation.
Right. So really, adrenaline, cortisol kicks in when our senses detect some sort of threat in our environment. We're talking about it on a basic level, very primitive. If we go back to the beginning of time, it's if there's some sort of threat that you needed to run away from in the wild, let's say, then it's safety. It's you're fleeing a lot of the time or fighting. Mm-hmm. In the context of trauma, however, this perceived threat is a little bit different. It's a lot of the times it can be an emotional threat, can be physical threat, can be psychological threat. Kind of has more complexity added to it beyond just survival. Mm-hmm. So what is happening when someone is responding to a traumatic experience and there's a heightened arousal? What's kind of happening more in the context of trauma? What is the functionality of that stress response?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the same way that it would in relation to a physical threat, because the brain doesn't just perceive, well, this is physical, so this matters more than the emotional threat. If it perceives an emotional threat, it is going to go into some of the same functioning, and it will increase the cortisol rate, will be activated to say to the brain and body, something in this environment is not okay. And then the emotion center flares up, and that's where you'll see either increased rates of like a fear response. Sometimes you'll see an anger response, depending on what is going on for the person in that situation. And then the person themselves will be trying to navigate through, how do I respond to this? Can I get out of this? Can I shut this down? Do I need to freeze, right? And it's encoding all that information all the time. So it's going to respond to the environment and or the person and or the situation in relation to a perceived threat that can be emotional. But remember, the brain and body see a threat is a threat is a threat, right? So it's the same neural networks that actually respond in an emotional threat as it would for a physical threat.
Mm-hmm. And like you were saying, sometimes it can be a fear response. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it can be anger. So depending on people's situations, a lot of the time, the more that circuitry is fired repeatedly over and over again, it gets really ingrained in people's minds. So, for example, if it is an anger response, some people might have more attunement to the emotions of anger in situations where maybe there isn't a threat later in life because of a traumatic experience they may have had earlier. When it comes to regulating the emotions, then, how might that impact the ability to form and maintain healthy relationships for individuals who are really attuned to fear or anger or just this hyper arousal and this constant state of being ready for some sort of perceived threat? How does that, because a lot of the time that can affect people's core beliefs, we call them, their view of themselves, of others, in the world around them. So what are the implications on forming healthy relationships for individuals recovering from traumatic experiences?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you think of some of the core values that children develop, really some of it is they want to be in the world to know that they're lovable, they're valued, they're safe, right? And as you begin to formulate around relationships, and if you're having more traumatic type experiences in some of your primary relationships, your core beliefs begin to change. So I am not able to be safe, to be valued, to be loved, right? And so your core belief may be, I am not lovable. So when you go into relationships, you're going to carry that, and you're going to have some sort of hyperarousal around that core belief that if I'm not lovable and I perceive that this person isn't here to value me, validate me, care for me, keep me safe, I may respond more with fear or anger or shame. There's other emotions that also sit around some of our real primitive emotions that are fear, let's say, and anger. And so you begin to process your world through some of those aroused emotions that may not allow you to attach to another person in a safe, healthy way. And you're in patterns like responses that you may not have as much control over until you learn how to go back in and identify some of those core beliefs that have been shaped into not feeling that you are worthy, safe, valued in the world. And you have to identify that in some therapeutic work or some really safe work that allows you to know that you're working to reshape those core beliefs and to re-regulate some of those intense emotions that can come in around traumatic experiences. You're actually looking to help your brain kind of reshape out those neural pathways that also align with how I perceive things, how I respond to things. And so there is a lot of research coming out around neuroplasticity and the capacity of the brain to change, to be able to be in the world and to see it in a more safe way, if it is safe.
Mm-hmm. You spoke a lot about these core beliefs and attachment, and we know we'll talk about this in our Trauma Across the Lifespan episode about how in those formative years, the early years of life, being able to attach onto our caregivers is a very vital part of our development. And if we don't have that sense of safety and security from the people who are supposed to, who as infants, they turn to have that safety and support, can have really have a lot of implications on the brain development as well.
Mm-hmm. Because the brain is then developing an out of stress response.
Exactly.
Right. And when you get a brain that develops out of stress response, it's going to be more prone to develop in a way that it's looking to survive all the time. And it impacts all parts of the brain, and the parts that are more your executive functioning, like your prefrontal cortex, you're going to see that it will not develop in the same way as for a brain that would be in an environment, safe relationships. So then you have less capacity to go in and organize thoughts and emotions. You might be more prone to having emotional expressions or outbursts that are harder to manage because you're kicking into a sense of I'm not safe versus I can see there's something that I need to negotiate around safety or I need to build trust, and I know I have capacity and skills to do that. It's like you go into a very primitive stress response and you may overreact or underreact.
Mm-hmm. Right, so they don't have that strong foundation that people who are nurtured and brought up in a loving and caring environment typically have.
And remember, the child has the least amount of control in some of their primary relationships and the environments that would, hold the space for those primary relationships. So for children, it's, very important to be able to give them those healthy attachments that validate and guide and respect and love. It is a fundamental human right to be safe in this world. Children have the right to be safe, but it is adults that have to create safe relationships, safe practices for them. And there's a reason why, because if we if we allow our children to grow up in safe relationships, safe spaces in a society that is violence free, or violence is addressed properly so they don't have to be exposed to so much, the future, is set in a better way, because these early on impacts have long-term implications. Yeah, there's health risks and also mental health risks, right? You can put those two side by side. They're like cousins, they hang out together. And if one isn't doing well, the other may not do well, right? And a lot of that can be initiated from unhealthy relationships that are threatening, abusive, that aren't respectful and honoring of our young people or any person.
When we talk about living in the world post-trauma, the brain can oftentimes kind of suppress and bury traumatic memories in a deeper place, but sometimes those memories can come up involuntarily in response to some sort of evocative cue or stimuli, or sometimes called triggers. Can you speak to kind of the implication of these triggers in just a day-to-day context, and how you might help people to identify these and work through these?
Yeah, this is a big piece of work, especially if you're in impact work, which is where you go into the impact of traumatic experiences. There's a really good book, The Body Keeps Scores, by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and he talks a lot about this from his work in working with actually veterans, and then going on to do a lot of other work around traumatic impact. But the body will keep score. So we're quite primitive, even at the end of the day, when we're more evolved, that our body and our brain, in the most intense experiences, are called light bulb moments. They can also be episodic moments where we take in the most intense information and we record it, because there's so much going on. The brain wants to take it in and remember it, especially if we're threatened. And so all our sensory sensory responses are activated, heightened, and we're taking in everything from sound, smells, touch, the way things present, how we bodily experience them, and we encode it. And so our brain will hold on to things that were very threatening. And it does that so it can bring them back up when we're in another situation and we are reminded of something that the brain and body are saying, this reminds me of something else that wasn't very safe. We're driven to survive. So the brain wants to recall it and say, hey, pay attention. Something about this reminds me of a previous situation when we weren't safe. But what can happen, that can overfire. So if we're sitting here today and it's dark around us because the lighting is to focus, on this recording, but if someone and either of us had a traumatic experience in the dark before, where someone had come out and threatened us, we could actually be activated into some sort of stress response, which means I have less ability to be in my thinking with you, because my body is now activating into a panic response, and I'm becoming very hyper aware of my surroundings. I might be listening to sounds. I might be watching things, trying to figure out, is there someone else out there? Is something bad going to happen? And that's automatic. It's not like I thought, oh, it's dark, I want to do this. My brain and body will just activate it up, because it's now saying, I'm not sure if we're safe, even though this is a very safe interaction. So people may activate up, they go into hyperarousal, there's some sort of stress response, heart rate is up, and they're starting to now look, do I need to fight, flight, freeze, or even fawning, which is another term to try and figure out how to make it okay with this person in front of me so that ultimately I'll be okay. And in those very primitive responses, people may not know they're in them. They might just be in it so overwhelming, and now it's starting to take over. And you lose some of that capacity to, okay, just sit back for a moment. What's really going on here? You're in a very primitive response, okay? So in knowing that, some of the work around impact is to start to name that is people bring in experiences where they're not sure why am I doing this? Why was I so angry? Why did I say that? Why did I get up and leave this interview when I was happy doing this interview? And it's like, okay, let's take a look at that. What was happening right before you decided to get up and walk away? And it could be, I don't know, I was having a panic attack. I felt eerie. I felt I wasn't safe. Okay, let's take that back into, was there ever another time in your life when you were in a situation where it may have been darker, things you were paying attention to, and then they take you into some sort of traumatic experience. So as you identify those markers, those triggers, those, sensory understandings, you start to work through, okay, so how do we now take you back into that and reformulate, help you recover your own capacity, not to be back where the original trauma was, but to be here and regulate through those activations.
Right, be here and present.
Be here and be present. And part of your work, if you're doing some of the therapeutic work, is to be able to stand in some of people's most traumatic memories and to help them find a way back through them.
And create space for them to be able to re-experience it in a way. I think you spoke to something really important about the stress response as well, as that the stimuli, we might not be aware of it a lot of the time. And the thing that's really triggering about it is the association. Our brains, because we're in that stress response, our brains can't really reason through that this is, in fact, a safe interaction. But the association that we had ingrained over and over and over again in the past between that stimuli and a threatening experience is what will come up involuntary. And a lot of the times it can be a sight thing, it can be a sound. Can also be smell. In the book, What Happened to You, they talk about the smell of Old Spice being a trigger for an individual in the book. So that's something that is really not in the forefront of your awareness. The smell is more of a passive stimuli. So things like that to be aware of. And like you mentioned, the therapeutic work can be really helpful to help people understand and be aware of what it is, identify these triggers and these evocative stimuli that bring up these negative outcomes and be able to work through them in a safe space.
Well, actually, smell is one of your most primitive sensory responses. Think of a baby. A baby can smell its parent. It knows its parent through smell. And that is a very primitive sensory response and an extremely strong response. If you think back to our topic on interpersonal violence and the correlation with alcohol, the smell of alcohol for a lot of violence survivors is something that can trigger their brain into a full panic attack if they're just out socially and they somehow smell alcohol in a way that it takes them back into a repressed memory. So when you think about our most primitive senses, they are there to help us survive, and also they're there to help us thrive.
When you think about your work as a clinician and within private practice and the other sectors you work in and as an educator, what is the role of psychoeducation? What do you think is the significance for both clients and students? What's kind of the benefit and maybe some of the downfalls of psychoeducation, what that brings to people?
Well, there's never a downfall over good education. Because for people to better understand that something happened to them and that the experiences that they're living through are not the fault of the person they are. Like, people will internalize, what's wrong with me? Why did I get up in this interview and walk away when it was such a great experience, but I was so panicked? There must be something wrong with me. When they can understand that that stress response that caused them to panic and to walk away was because of an activation based on an original traumatic experience they had no choice to go through, it allows them to reclaim their personhood, to know that they're not flawed, that there's not something wrong with them. It is something happened to them. What happened to you is a very powerful statement because it takes the onus off of something is wrong with you, which is a messaging a lot of people get. It's like, what was wrong with you? Why couldn't you get through that? Why did you overreact? Why are you so emotional? You'll see this language, this shaming language put onto people versus what happened to you in that moment when you became so, caught in that emotion. Help me understand of how I could have been a safer person with you so we could have worked this through together. And so I think education is the powerful tool to allow people to understand that they're not flawed, in those responses. It is an impact they're not aware of yet of why their brain and body needs to go into hyperarousal or is so acute, right, in relation to some sort of expression of emotion they feel they don't have control over. Because in emotion, any emotional response is part of being a human. If you have emotional response, it means you are more human than someone that has no emotions at all.
It's really validating the experience.
Yes.
And normalizing that the stress response and what's happening in the brain is a neurobiological process to protect them.
To protect, yes. And it also puts more onus on society to get more involved. If someone is having let's say a trigger and or some sort of sensory response to a situation and they aren't able in that moment to feel like they can control it, then the people around them can also participate in saying, how can I be more helpful? But if we put the responsibility only with the person and, what's wrong with you? Why would you do that? We don't have to take any responsibility in saying, do we make sure people are safe when they come into experiences? Do we make sure adults are actually parenting in a way that's beneficial to children? Do we make sure we have resources in society that are supporting our families that are in stress so that they can be the parents they could be? There's a real social responsibility when we start to look at education and understanding that we all are a part, right, of making it better in the world so that people can be safer and or if they've been impacted, they can have resources to heal with.
And then just to end on a note of hope, I'm wondering if you can speak to, so we talked a bit about the potential of the brain to adapt and rearrange itself and the neural connections based on its ability to be plastic and its ability to adapt in a way that's more helpful for people and sometimes unhelpful through repetition and consolidation. So when we talk about this concept of post-traumatic growth, and the potential for hope and improvement of people's states post-traumatic event, how does that mechanism of plasticity contribute to that work of post-traumatic growth?
Well, if you take it back to even the basics, if someone comes in for some sort of help, or they talk to someone about the impact of something that's occurred to them and they've never talked about it before, the act of validating, of creating a safe space, of honoring a story within itself will begin to change neuroplasticity. Because a person is able to be valued, to be seen, right, to be recognized in their suffering, that can allow them to experience themselves differently. Not as the person that's broken or bad or couldn't do or something like that. That change allows the cortisol to go down, right? It allows a person to feel the emotional experience of they matter, that they're believed. And that in itself starts to change the brain. I mean, if you think of a child, when they come to an adult and the adult says, I'm so happy you brought that to me. They light up, they experience joy, they experience dopamine, it's a chemical that gets released. Serotonin is rebooting. They don't have any cortisol. If a child comes to a parent or a person and it's like, why did you do that? I've told you 10 times and kind of go into that rant of some sort of child begins to shut down, cortisol will be released to some degree. Serotonin drops, dopamine is not, right, formulating. So that brain goes into stress. The same thing occurs in a healthy, safe relationship. So the brain will reformulate, right? Those neurotransmitters fire up in a different way. The body, all the chemicals in the body reboot, and you come out of stress response. You come into a state of growth. And that brings back the capacity, right, of the person to enter into the world and to be in the world differently, to want to be in the world differently. That can shape out the difference between someone not believing they have the right to be in the world in a healthy way and believing they have the right to live in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. So all that post-traumatic growth is the human potential comes back, right? The potential of the person to be in this world in their strongest capacity. And that is what, really is the work of heroes. If you think some of the work around the hero's journey, it is to experience something and to go through the healing and to come back over and to give back and change humanity. So that post-traumatic growth has the power to change, right? To allow that person to find their deepest self, their deepest potential, and the brain and body responds to that.
So you're kind of equating post-traumatic growth to the beginning stages being just sitting in a room, making space for someone and just starting to shift some perspectives and show some compassion to someone's experience. That's kind of the very, very start of where that growth can begin.
Yeah, that is the growth or it is the space where growth can begin. And that can be held anywhere in a safe, validating relationship that seeks to understand what happened to you.
And I think that's important to point out too is therapeutic settings doesn't necessarily have to be with a healthcare professional in an office. It can be with a friend or a loved one or someone who cares about you and respects you. Therapeutic value can come from just important relationships with those individuals as well.
Any person, any caring person, right? And you're even seeing it, some of that education, like you look at some of the social media movements, I'll call them, that opened up the possibility to name some of the violence that people have gone through or some of the impact. Even that's that educational piece and why it matters. Good education allows people to understand something, and then they take it into a safe relationship and they'll be validated in it. This did happen to me. I'm sharing this. Someone's wanting to understand that. And then that can take it further into resources and growth opportunities and healing, right? Whatever that healing would be.
Yeah, there's many opportunities, I think, in more recent times for that growth to happen within society. It's a little bit more embedded than in the past.
Yeah, because I think, as we begin to better understand the impact in neuroscience and neuropsychology, and you're just seeing so much more education and understanding of the impact, how it impacts us as individuals, in our bodies, in our minds. But then also how can we build in resources, education, resources, research, right? And then roll that all over and bring it back into the public, right? Anything that brings it back over to the public sphere has the potential. It's kind of like the domino effect. What you bring forward here can impact across the world, right? And has the potential to shape out, right? Another person, another project, another resource.
And speaking of resources, I think we'll have those included in the description below for any kind of trauma and psychological, just well-being resources as well will be included.
Wonderful.
So that's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. Dr. Miller, do you have any final thoughts?
No, thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to our next episode.
So do I. Thanks, Dr. Miller.
Thank you.